Welcome to This Horror Real.
The knocking started inside my apartment 10 minutes after I watched the maintenance worker lock up and leave, and when I called his company to ask if he had forgotten something, they told me he had already finished every unit on the property hours earlier. I live in a large apartment complex in Dallas, and that afternoon, maintenance was scheduled to replace a leaking valve beneath my kitchen sink. The worker introduced himself as Andre, completed the repair, showed me the new part, and left. I watched him walk down the hallway carrying his toolbox before disappearing into the elevator. The work order was marked complete. As far as I knew, the visit was over. About 10 minutes later, I was carrying trash toward the dumpster when I realized I had forgotten my wallet. As I walked back toward my apartment, I heard 3 slow knocks. The sound wasn't coming from another unit. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from behind my own front door. Someone was inside my apartment. I stood frozen for several seconds before the knocking stopped. I convinced myself something had fallen over. Maybe the repair shifted a pipe. Maybe I was overreacting. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, expecting a simple explanation. Instead, every room looked untouched. Nothing appeared missing. Nothing appeared disturbed. Yet the silence felt wrong. It felt like I had interrupted something before it could continue. An hour later, I left to grab food. When I returned, I heard the knocking before I even reached my apartment. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. This time, there was no doubt. The sound was coming from somewhere inside the walls. As I slid my key into the lock, the knocking stopped immediately. Whoever or whatever was making the noise knew exactly when I arrived. I searched every room, closets, cabinets, bathroom, under the bed, behind furniture. Nothing. Every window was locked. Andre had been the only stranger inside my apartment all week. I kept trying to blame the plumbing repair until I noticed the access panel beneath the kitchen sink wasn't fully closed anymore. It looked like someone had opened it after the repair was finished. The panel had originally been secured with 4 screws. Now it only had 3. I searched the floor but couldn't find the missing screw. Andre had specifically shown me the completed repair before leaving. I clearly remembered the panel being fully secured. Now one corner hung slightly open. The more I stared at it, the less it looked like maintenance equipment and the more it looked like an entrance. That night I mentioned the knocking to my neighbor, Malik. His expression changed immediately. He asked which maintenance worker had entered my apartment. When I described Andre, Malik became visibly uncomfortable. He told me another resident had complained about noises inside her walls after a maintenance visit months earlier. Management blamed settling pipes. The resident moved out shortly afterward. Before going back to his apartment, Malik stopped and asked one more question. "Are you sure his name was Andre?" I told him yes. Malik looked confused. "I've lived here 6 years. We've never had an Andre." The following afternoon I was working from home when 3 knocks echoed through the wall at exactly 3:17 p.m. The next day it happened again. Same time, same pattern. 3 knocks. Every hair on my arm stood up. This wasn't random. Someone was following a schedule. Someone knew exactly when I would be there to hear it. That evening I removed the access panel completely. Behind it was a narrow maintenance crawl space connecting multiple apartments. I pointed my flashlight inside and immediately noticed fresh shoe prints pressed into the dust. The tracks weren't old, they were recent. Then I noticed something stranger. There were 2 different shoe sizes. One set was larger than the other. The footprints stopped beneath the wall behind my bedroom. Following the trail farther into the crawl space, I saw both sets of footprints leading toward the neighboring apartment. When I knocked on that unit's door, nobody answered. Later, I learned the tenant had moved out nearly 3 weeks earlier. The apartment was vacant. That night, while standing outside the building, I looked toward the empty unit. A light switched on inside. The second I stared at the window, the light switched off. I called management immediately. While waiting for someone to arrive, I sat in my kitchen watching the open crawl space. Several minutes passed. Then I heard movement. Not knocking, movement. A slow scraping sound echoed through the wall. Something shifted deeper inside the crawl space. Then whispering followed. I couldn't understand the words, but whoever was speaking sounded close enough to touch. The next morning, I left my phone recording beside the open panel before leaving for work. That evening, I reviewed the footage. For nearly 7 hours, nothing happened. Then at exactly 3:16 p.m., my kitchen door slowly opened by itself. Nobody entered. Nobody exited. 1 minute later, 3 knocks echoed through the wall. Then a man's voice whispered, "He's gone now." A few seconds later, another voice answered from farther inside the crawl space, "Not yet." Management arrived with security and searched the crawl space. They found food wrappers, bottled water, batteries, charging cables, a flashlight, and a folded blanket hidden inside the walls. Someone had clearly been spending time there. Yet despite searching every accessible section, security never found a person. They claimed whoever had been there escaped before they arrived. I wanted to believe that. Then, 2 hours after they left, I checked the crawl space again and found a cold bottle of water sitting near the back wall. It hadn't been there during the search. While security continued inspecting the property, one employee found a printed photograph wedged behind a support beam. At first, it looked harmless. It showed the apartment courtyard. Then I noticed the angle. The photograph had been taken from inside my living room window. The printed date revealed it was captured more than a week before the maintenance visit. Someone had been watching me long before the repair happened. Even worse, standing near the edge of the photograph was a man who looked exactly like Andre. Management concluded that a trespasser entered through an unsecured maintenance access point and escaped before security arrived. Most residents accepted the explanation. I tried to accept it too. Then small objects inside my apartment started moving. A TV remote left on the counter appeared on the couch. A kitchen chair would be slightly pulled away from the table. Nothing major disappeared, just enough to let me know someone had been there. Every afternoon at exactly 3:17 p.m., the knocking continued. A week later, management replaced every maintenance lock on the property. Residents believed the problem had finally been solved. Then one evening, I returned home and found a maintenance request form taped to my door. My apartment number was written across the top. The request was dated 2 days after the locks had been changed. In the description section, someone had written only 3 words, "Still inside here." The following morning, I requested hallway camera footage. Management reluctantly agreed. The video showed nobody approaching my apartment the day the maintenance form appeared. Nobody walked through the hallway. Nobody touched my door. Yet at 4:12 p.m., the paper suddenly appeared between 2 camera frames. One moment the door was empty. The next moment the form was attached. Management blamed a camera malfunction. Nobody believed them. Later that night, just before midnight, 3 knocks came from the wall beside my bed. Then something happened that I had never heard before. A 4th knock. It came directly from underneath my bed. I grabbed my keys, left everything behind, and spent the night in a hotel. I never slept in that apartment again. I moved out 2 weeks later. Months passed before Malik called unexpectedly. A new tenant had rented my old apartment. 3 days after moving in, he reported hearing knocking inside the walls. Management blamed old plumbing again. Then Malik told me something that made my stomach drop. The new tenant never had a maintenance visit. Nobody had entered his apartment before the knocking started. Whatever was inside those walls had already been there long before Andre showed up. Maybe Andre wasn't responsible. Maybe he discovered it too. Or maybe he was part of it. Either way, the knocking never stopped. Most warning signs don't seem dangerous when you first notice them. They're small details, repeated patterns, unexplained sounds, and explanations that almost make sense. The frightening part is realizing how many people saw the same warning signs before you and chose to ignore them. Have you ever experienced strange activity in an apartment, hotel, workplace, or neighborhood that nobody could explain? Share your story below. Someone else may recognize the warning signs before it's too late. Welcome to this horror reel.